This story takes place in the city of Fidget, which is located in the southern region of the Alzano Empire. Inside the city are its most well-known college of magic, the Alzano Imperial Magic Academy, and its proud students. In the starting scene, a boy reads a story about a legendary battle between a demon lord and the lightning mage. As he finishes the book, the voice of an older guy is heard saying that all he ever wanted is to be a mage of justice. One fateful morning, one of the students of Al Academy, Rumia Tingel, meets an injured man on her way to school. She quickly rushes over to the man and heals him with her magic. The man thanks her for her service, but Rumia tells him to keep it a secret, as apparently using magic outside the school premises is prohibited. The man understands and wishes her a good day. Her little sister, Cien, joins her shortly. As they both continue on their journey to school, they keep wondering why their homeroom teacher suddenly quit coming to school. Rumia says she hasn't the slightest clue. Cien says she heard they're having a new substitute teacher who's starting that day. Little did they know, they were going to run into their doofus teacher in a few seconds. On another side of town, their substitute teacher races down to his school, as it was his first day at school, and runs into Cien and Rumia. To avoid injuries, Cien blasts their teacher into the fountain in front of them. The teacher still gets out of the water to touch Rumia again. Cien gets even more annoyed and throws him into the fountain a second time. Then, Rumia and her sister Cien continue to school. The whole school is surprised to find out their substitute teacher is late on his first day. Cien and Rumia are even more shocked when they find out their substitute teacher is the doofus they met earlier in town. Even a fellow teacher named Holly relays his complaints to Headmaster Rick for allowing such a dummy to teach a class in the prestigious academy. Headmaster Rick tells him that although his qualifications are average at best, he was still recommended by one of the most respected professors in the academy, Professor Celica. Holly keeps making a fuss about the substitute until Celica walks in on them and chases him out. Once the grievous teacher is gone, Celica tells the headmaster she just wants Glenn Radars, the substitute teacher, to live a good life and that she's ready to take full responsibility for anything he does in the school. Meanwhile, Glenn keeps writing rubbish on the chalkboard. The students are even more surprised that their substitute teacher is as lazy as they come. A student named Lynn asks him a question about how to translate the runic symbols he wrote on the board into their language. However, Glenn tells her to check a dictionary instead. This level of nonchalance makes Cien very upset. She stands up and berates the teacher for acting so indifferent toward his students. Glenn just keeps a straight face and tells Cien there's absolutely nothing he can do about it. Cien keeps arguing with him until the bell rings. Glenn rushes out of freedom as soon as he hears the bell. The girls hit the changing room to freshen up before their next classes. While they do their thing, the dummy teacher strikes again. Glenn accidentally barges into the girls' changing room and keeps staring at the girls until he gets knocked out immediately. During the lunch break, Glenn joins Cien and Rumia to eat some of his stir-fried kulia beans. Rumia asks for a bite, and Sensei gives her some. He asks Cien if she'd like to eat, but Cien says no. Instead, she tries to speak her mind. As she opens her mouth to talk, Glenn stuffs it with his kolia beans. Cien gets angry again as she wonders what to do with the teacher. After their lunch break, Glenn keeps up with an I don't care attitude. When Cien's had enough, she challenges her teacher to a magic duel. The students gasp out in disbelief, as it's never been heard of before. Glenn accepts her challenge and faces his student in the open space outside their class. Before beginning the fight, Glenn tells Cien they can only use one spell, the shock bolt. Cien agrees to his terms and begins her chant. She lands her first shock bolt on her teacher and shocks his body stiff. Glenn stands up and tells her to begin the fight again. Glenn keeps getting shocked by his own student. Everyone, including me, is shocked. Who is Glenn, and why is he holding back? Glenn is out again. This time he nails his teaching book to the board and tells the students to keep studying by themselves. Seems like getting beaten by a student didn't faze him at all. Rumia comes by to ask him another question, but Glenn tells her to go check it out by herself. Cien helps Rumia to her seat and begins an argument with her teacher over magic. While she thinks magic is a good thing meant for the edification of humans, Glenn thinks otherwise. Instead, Glenn tells her magic, which is supposed to benefit mankind, is nothing but bad for us humans. He says magic has always been weaponized in every era that ever existed, and that nothing much has been done about it. Cien gets angry yet again at her teacher for talking down on her views. She ends up slapping him with tears on her face before running out of class crying. That evening, Glenn thinks about the incident that happened earlier on. He discovers that he's been in the wrong and decides to apologize to Cien. As he walks back down, he finds Rumia in a practical room having trouble activating a magic circle. Glenn gets to the room and helps her pour some more mercury into the circle. Then, he tells her to activate the circle again. Rumia does so, and this time it works. Glenn gets to watch Rumia's face light up with happiness after her experiment. Glenn walks Rumia back outside. Rumia keeps asking him questions about his past, but Glenn cuts her off immediately. Maybe he was Baba in his past. Who knows? Anyways, Glenn asks her why she always reveres being a mage. Rumia tells him her origin story. According to the past, Rumia was banished from her own home and resorted to living with Cien. At one point, she was kidnapped by a horde of people and rescued earlier on by a mage of justice. Hearing this story, Glenn gets surprised, almost like he remembers something. Rumia says ever since she was saved, she's made up her mind to be a mage so she can thank her savior. Glenn greets her goodbye and heads home. On his way home, he remembers Rumia asking him to apologize to Cien for telling her magic is useless. Apparently, Cien had a bond with her late grandpa and had promised him she'd make his dream of her becoming a mage come true. At that moment, Cien is seen in her room reminiscing about the time she had with her grandpa in his last moments. The next day at school, Glenn apologizes and gets serious for once in his life. He tells them to deviate from the textbook way of casting spells and try different approaches to casting magic spells. The students, who think he's just speaking his usual crap, are shocked when Glenn teaches them several ways to activate and manipulate the shock bolt. After that, he teaches the students some valuable lessons about spell words and their meanings. He demonstrates his theory by activating the shock bolt without even saying the proper spell words. The students are very impressed with this side of Glenn. Ever since his amazing class, Glenn's popularity spread all around the school. Even students from other classes would attend his class in droves just so they could hear the legend speak. One evening, Glenn gives his recent experience some thought. Celica joins him on the roof and teases him for going from zero to hero in the school. She also warns him to be very careful with the ladies around, but Glenn tells her he's not a ladies' man. Just then, Rumia and Cien approach him to ask for his help. Glenn acts sassy at first, but eventually helps them out. That night, Rumia and Cien both groom each other. Rumia teases Cien, telling her she might develop feelings for the teacher later on. At this point, elsewhere, some creepy people in masks meet over an evil plan they wish to carry out at the school during the Academy's magic conference. Someone brings up Glenn as being a threat to them, but the other person tells him Glenn is no match for them. The next day, Glenn gets attacked on his way to school by 2 military soldiers. A few minutes later, the 2 military men barge into Glenn's classroom. As usual, the students are there waiting for their teacher. Cien asks the military men for their identity, but they don't reveal themselves. She keeps running her mouth until one of the men shuts her up. Then, they ask the class for Rumia. Naturally, no one responds to their question. The men threaten to off the students one by one if Rumia doesn't expose herself. Just as they're about to start, Rumia exposes herself. Cien tells the perpetrators Glenn would soon come to their rescue. However, the men tell her they'd already killed the teacher. Up next, one of the intruders takes Cien to a dark room so he could have his way with her. Cien, who's usually high and mighty, begs for her life to be spared. This only makes the man want her more, so he continues groping her. Glenn arrives a little while later and shows the attacker the full Arcana card, a card which stops all magic from happening. Since nobody can do any magic, they can only resort to hand-to-hand combat. The intruder gets the beating of his life as Glenn throws him, kicks, and punches him until he passes out. After taking down Cien's attacker, Glenn and his student tie him up to be interrogated. Glenn notices the weird symbol on the intruder's hand, the symbol belonging to those filthy mages who call themselves the researchers of divine wisdom. He then receives a call from Celica and informs her of the incident going on in the academy at the moment. Celica asks him how they managed to break through the school barrier, and Glenn tells her it must have been an inside job, seeing as the academy's barrier is much stronger than any barrier created. He also tells her the intruders have taken some students hostage and that she should be quick to come over to the school to help out. Celica tells him she'd do something about it and cuts the call. After the call, Cien rushes to find her sister. Glenn stops her and tells her they'd find Rumia together. For the first time ever, Glenn actually takes responsibility for his students. Before they leave, a portal opens in a corner of the room and brings the bone golems into the school. The golems take out the capture man and face Glenn and Cien. Glenn strengthens his fist with magic and punches the head off one of the golems. He and Cien run to the corridor, and the golems follow them. Glenn decides to end the golems once and for all. He tasks Cien with creating a gale blow magic attack that'll be wide enough to cover and take out the entire horde of bone zombies. He fights the golems one by one and buys Cien enough time to activate the spell. When she's done activating it, she speaks the words and activates the gale blow. The resulting gush of wind keeps the golems at bay. While Cien thinks she's failed her master, Glenn is just happy she was able to deliver exactly what he needed. He takes out a red, bright rock from his pocket and uses it to cast some black magic spell called Extinction Ray, which incinerates all the bone golems and sends them back to the underworld. Once the enemies have been dispelled, Glenn collapses cold and out of mana. Cien helps him up, but unfortunately for the duo, their main enemy arrives. This time, it's a long-haired dude with bright floating swords revolving around him. Glenn asks Cien if she still has mana to activate Dispel Force and disable the swords. Cien tells him yes, and he throws her out the window. The enemy begins his first attack and pierces some parts of Glenn's body. In an effort to use his magic quenching card, Glenn activates the shock bolt and holds out the card. This is so that if the enemy attacks Glenn, he either gets the shock of his life or risks having his spell quenched. The enemy sees through this logic and protects himself. He commends Glenn for thinking this one through and sends his floating swords toward him. Glenn takes the hit and waits for Cien to activate her Dispel Force magic. She comes at just the right time and disables the magic around the swords. Glenn takes one of the swords, launches himself at the defenseless enemy, and takes him out. Before he dies, the man remembers Glenn as the infamous mage killer back in the day. Cien approaches her master, who's already down, and activates a healing spell on him. Glenn and Cien fall asleep that night and restore their energy for the next day. The next morning, Celica calls Glenn to give him updates. She says the barrier put by the enemy around the school is stopping anybody from getting out. This could only mean the researchers of Divine Wisdom planned to do whatever they want to do in the school. Glenn thanks her for the information, leaves Cien, who's still sleeping, and starts looking for Rumia. Glenn finds Rumia in the school's penthouse with her former teacher, Huey. Apparently, Huey quit his former job as a teacher to join the researchers and was there to be used as a sacrifice to teleport Rumia back to their base. Glenn asks him why they want Rumia so badly, and Huey tells him it's because she survived from a fatal disease. Just then, Huey reveals the 5-layer magic circle around Rumia, which had about 10 minutes to activate and send her back to the base. Glenn now had two options. He either attacked the teacher and killed him, which would activate the spell, or he could try to save Rumia in any way he could. Glenn chooses the latter. He bites his wrist and uses his blood to write spells on each layer of the magic circle. He manages to release 4 layers of the circle before passing out. Rumia reaches out from her barrier and uses her special amplifier ability to increase Glenn's mana. Glenn wakes back up and undoes the magic barrier. Now that he's lost, Huey accepts his fate and allows himself to get punched in the face by Glenn. Cien gets to the penthouse and finds Glenn resting in her sister's hands. A few days later, after Glenn's recovery, Celica tells Glenn that Rumia is one of the few people with special abilities. Since the kingdom hates people with magic abilities so much, they naturally want to take her out. Glenn joins his 2 favorite students, Rumia and Cien, in their journey to the academy. Queen Alicia of the Alzano Empire summons the Grand Commander of the Imperial Guard, Zealous, to talk to him about visiting the academy. On getting to her room, Zealous advises her not to go so as to avoid their secret from getting out. Now, what's the secret the royals wish to keep? Turns out Rumia is Queen Alicia's daughter and princess of the Alzano Empire. She was banished from her home 3 years ago after discovering that she had special powers. To avoid an uprising in the kingdom, if the locals ever found out the royal house was keeping someone with a special ability alive, they'd rebel against the throne. After hearing Zealous's advice, Alicia decides to keep to the palace. She also mentions how it's been 3 years since she last saw her daughter and wishes that Rumia doesn't hate her already. Glenn arrives late, as usual, to his class and finds out Cien and Rumia were having trouble finding volunteers in their class to participate in a magic event held once a year in the academy. Glenn takes the reins from his students and decides he's giving this event his all. The students are very shocked as Glenn starts selecting students for various competitions in the event. Some of them even object to his judgment. However, Glenn explains the reason why he selected them until they accept it. When all's been said and done, Glenn heaves a sigh of relief. Apparently, Glenn's class had no choice but to win, or else he wouldn't qualify to receive the bonus cash from the headmaster. Glenn's bad spending habit had left him broke before the month's end, so he desperately needs this cash. At least the lazy teacher is taking something seriously for once. Someone in his class suggests they use only the top students in their class in the competition, but Cien cuts in and says it's much better that they all participate as a class. Glenn is mystified, as he was already considering changing his team to the best students. That evening, Glenn watches his students practicing in the yard outside class when Class 2 barge in to take over the training ground. Glenn cuts in and defends his class, telling Holly and his class to beat it since they met them there first. Holly keeps on rambling until Glenn bets Holly 3 months' worth of their salary that his class will win. Holly almost accepts the bet, if not for Cien, who steps in and saves the day. She successfully chases Holly and his class off their training ground. Over the next few scenes, Glenn and his class practice hard for the upcoming event. One night, Rumia is seen on her balcony, remembering the night she was saved by the Mage of Justice. Cien walks into her room to call her down for dinner. Rumia happily joins her, and they all have a happy dinner together with Cien's parents. The next day, the queen rides off to the magic event with a happy look on her face. She gets there in one piece and kickstarts the magic event. She also gets to see her daughter Rumia again, all grown up and healthy. Anyways, the event begins and Glenn's class does exceptionally well in the first competition, which is the flying competition. Celica, who's sitting near the queen, gets very excited that Glenn's class is winning. In the next few events, Glenn's class performs well above average, landing them in the top 3 best classes of the entire event. Glenn is supposed to be happy and cheering his class on. However, his broken self's empty stomach wouldn't let him rest. After a few more competitions, it's finally time for the most dreadful competition ever, the mental defense competition. The nominee for Glenn's class is Rumia. She faces 7 other people, including the champion of last year's mental defense competition, Gale from Class 5. The Academy's best mental mage, Count Zest, is called on to begin the competition. He casts spells one after the other, each spell increasing in difficulty and severity. After the first few mental defense spells, all the other contestants aside from Gale and Rumia pass out like flies. Count Zest is very impressed with them, so he decides to use the strongest spell in his arsenal, the Mind Break. He speaks out the first wave, which doesn't affect the last 2 students standing. Then he decides to increase his pace. On the second wave, Rumia falls to her knees. The Count asks her if she could continue, but Glenn says she's going to forfeit. Glenn takes his student and comforts her. This means Gale is the winner, right? Wrong. Turns out Gale had passed out while standing from the second wave. This can only mean Rumia is the winner since she's still conscious. A long defeat for Rumia quickly turns into a win for the whole of Glenn's class. The Queen and Celica are both very happy for her. Queen Alicia tells Celica how happy she feels to finally see her daughter again after 3 years of abandoning her. The magic contest continues with Class 2 climbing very fast up the ranks. The announcer mentions Glenn's name again, which spooks the 2 court mages who were at the arena on an investigation. The shorter one of them, Rael, wants to settle her age-old score with Glenn. However, her partner, Albert, tells her to focus more on their task. Apparently, they got word that someone amongst the Imperial Guards is plotting against the Queen. Although their first suspect is zealous, they still have to be careful and give him the benefit of the doubt. Rael has no choice but to stay with her partner and leave settling any scores for later. In the next scene, Glenn's hungry stomach gets to witness the students flaunt and munch on their delicious sandwiches. As he whines in his sorrows, Lynn calls for his help. Glenn takes a more secluded space to hear her problem. Lynn tells him she feels less confident in her ability to do the self-illusion spell. The self-illusion spell, which transforms the caster into an entirely different thing, requires the caster to have a very good visual image of the person or thing they'd like to turn into. Glenn figures out Lynn is just having trouble picturing the image of the person she wants to transform into. So, he transforms into Rumia and encourages Lynn to give it a go. Lynn thanks him and leaves to keep practicing. Before Glenn changes back to himself, Cien comes by with a box filled with sandwiches. Since Glenn is still in Rumia's form by this time, Cien gladly gives the box to him. Glenn is about to take his first bite out of the box when the real Rumia comes. Cien changes him back to his normal self and blasts him into the forest. Glenn surprisingly survives the fall with his growling stomach and wonders why life is so cruel to him. Lucky for him, Rumia comes by with all the sandwiches. Glenn could not believe his eyes and asks Rumia if there's a catch. Rumia tells him there's none, and he munches heavily on the sandwiches. Over the next few minutes, Glenn and Rumia sit on the bench near them and talk as Glenn eats. When he's finally full, Glenn gets up to take his leave. He is, however, stopped in his tracks when Her Majesty Queen Alicia approaches them. Back at the arena, the Imperial Guards find out about the Queen's absence, so they immediately begin searching for her. Meanwhile, Glenn pays his respects to the Queen and asks her what she was doing there. Without question, the Queen moves on to her daughter, Princess Helena Acaria. She greets Rumia warmly and was perhaps expecting the same in return. However, Rumia rejects the Queen as her mother and runs away. Her Majesty understands Rumia's feelings and returns to the arena. At the entrance, Zealous holds the Queen at sore point and captures her. Albert spies in on them and wonders if his hunch had been right all along. He knows Zealous to be a very careful man and thinks someone else is pulling the strings. In the meantime, Class 2's Teresa wins another competition. Again, Glenn's on one side, thinking hard about the princess. Cien approaches him and asks him where Rumia could be. Glenn tells her about Rumia's recent encounter, and Cien understands. Glenn leaves Cien to go look for Rumia. He finds her somewhere outside the arena and talks to her. Rumia tells her master she didn't know how to react to her mother suddenly wanting her back again. She says although she understands why she was banished in the first place, her heart still feels grievous about how she was treated. Glenn tells her it's human to feel regret after an action, so she should just choose her path instead and focus on her true feelings. Rumia tells him she doesn't know how to feel, but Glenn tells her she should confront her mother about it first instead of just keeping to herself. At that moment, the Imperial Guard approach the two of them and charge Rumia with treason to the throne, so she'll be executed. Rumia pleads guilty to the charges so the guards can leave Glenn. Glenn tries to confront her, but the guards knock him out. In the next scene, Rumia is tied up to a tree and about to be executed by the road guards. Just as they're about to thrust their swords into her, Glenn creates a bright light and blinds the guards. More guards approach them, so Glenn has to go. He picks Rumia up and super jumps to the roofs of buildings. He suspects something is going on within the royal family, so he needs to meet with the queen himself. He places a call to Celica and waits for her to answer. Celica gives very little information about her whereabouts and speaks in code language. She keeps telling Glenn that it all rests on him now. Glenn thinks about this a little bit and concludes that Celica and all other important members of the royal family, including the queen and the senators, have been captured and held against their will. This means he has to get down to business. Rael finally catches up to Glenn and attacks him. The queen's handmaiden, Eleanor, exposes her true identity to Celica. She tells the legendary mage that she's a member of the researchers of divine wisdom and has given the queen a cursed necklace. Celica is shocked that she was oblivious to the treachery, but her hands are tied. If she does anything to Eleanor, the curse on the necklace activates, and the queen dies. Somewhere around town, Rael engages Glenn in close magic-to-magic combat. Albert notices his partner's absence and finds him fighting Glenn. Albert knocks Rael out and meets Glenn once again. After the necessary hellos, Glenn introduces Rumia to Rael and Albert. Albert tells Glenn that the Imperial Guards have placed Her Majesty under watch while they search for and kill Rumia. They all contemplate what to do, and Rael advises they all charge the enemy through the front. But Glenn tells them they can trust in Celica, the greatest sorcerer at the time. In the meantime, Class 2 gets worried over Glenn's sudden disappearance. Just as they're about to give up hope, Albert and Rael meet with them. They introduce themselves and tell the students that Glenn's on an important mission, so he charged them with covering for his absence in the competition and seeing it through to the end. The students feel pretty weird about letting total strangers lead them through the rest of the magic competition. However, Cien talks some sense into them. It's time for the transmutation competition, and Lin is up against Class 1 Sita. Sita is up first. He transforms into a majestic dragon and scores 37 points. Lin is called to the stage to do her presentation. She gets cold feet at first, but Albert encourages her and tells her to try her best. Lin warms up and transforms into Lilica, an angel right out of iconography. This transformation gets her 40 full points, putting her ahead of Sita. The next few events take place, and Class 2 eventually gets closer to Class 1. Class 2 wins the next event again and ties up with Class 1 at 195 points each. Now, at the final event, which is the Magic Duel, 3 members from each class must face each other in a 1 versus 1 duel to take home the win. Cien, Gibble, and Cash go for Class 2. Cash loses, but Gibble wins, putting Class 2 and Class 1 in a tie yet again. In the deciding match, Cien faces Heal from Class 1. Although Heal's fire magic is strong, he's still no match for Cien's Gale Blow. Cien uses her powerful magic to push Heal out of the fight zone and secures the win for Class 2. Meanwhile, the guards finally catch up to Glenn and Rumia. Back in town, when the time comes to award prizes for the winners, Albert and Rael step up to the queen. Everyone is surprised that 2 mages would do something like that. Just then, Albert and Rael make the big reveal. It turns out they'd used self-illusion magic to conceal their true selves and appear as Albert and Rael. This could only mean that the real Albert and Rael disguised themselves as Glenn and Rumia and were distracting the guards earlier. They dispelled the magic and transformed back to Glenn and Rumia. Zealous, upon finding out about this, orders the guards to capture them. Celica quickly puts up an isolation barrier to keep the guards out until they set things right. Glenn tells the queen about Zealous being the traitor. The queen and Celica keep quiet until one of them breaks the silence. The queen, who's in serious pain, orders Zealous to execute her only daughter. She also regrets the day Rumia was born and says she's brought nothing but pain and regret to the family. Rumia breaks down after hearing these things. Zealous immediately unsheathes his sword to put Rumia down. Glenn, on the other hand, knows something is very, very wrong. He notices the look on Her Majesty's face and compliments her necklace. Then he speaks in some sort of code language to confirm his suspicions before rushing toward the Queen and taking a hit from Zealous. This distraction gives the Queen enough time to get the necklace off her neck and break the curse. Zealous is surprised the curse didn't activate. According to legend, the curse activates itself and kills its wearer if she forcefully takes it off. Glenn shows him his card, the Fool Arcana, which dispels all magic within a certain range. Now that the Queen is saved, Zealous is arrested, and the isolation barrier is lifted. In another part of town, Albert and Rael corner Eleanor, the Queen's handmaiden, to question her. However, the criminal only tells them they're after the princess for the Ashik records before disappearing into thin air. That evening, Glenn thanks Albert and Rael for their help and bids them goodbye. The Queen also leaves after talking to her granddaughter for a while. Celica tells her to trust Glenn to take care of her granddaughter in the meantime. Rumia thanks her master for helping her find her true feelings. Glenn tells her he has to fulfill the promise he made to the Queen 3 years ago. Together, the duo walks into a restaurant, only to find out all the students are already dead drunk from eating brandy-infused cakes. Glenn finds out he's going to be spending the reward and the bet he won from Holly to settle all his students' bills. Poor Glenn, imagine getting rich and broke in just one day. A few hours to dawn, Glenn and Cien are seen making odd sounds. Seriously, what's with anime and suspicious sounds? Thankfully, more screen time is allowed for the duo, and we find out Glenn's making Cien practice close military-grade hand-to-hand combat. After their training, Cien feels tired and asks Glenn why he made her go through the trouble of learning such a hard fighting style. Glenn tells her she has to be sturdy in her physical skills if she's ever going to learn military-grade magic. Cien understands his point and thanks him before heading back home to change for school. A few hours later, Cien and Rumia meet Glenn looking all gloomy. They ask him what the matter is, and Glenn tells them he hates the fact that he always walks on the same street as them. Just then, Rael attacks Glenn from behind. Glenn defends her sword attack and finds out Rael is the one the Imperial government assigned to guard Rumia while posing as a student. Glenn knows Rael and her hard-headedness, so he tries speaking some sense into her. Rael has been known to drift from her mission at times, so Glenn makes sure she understands her role. In the next scene, Glenn introduces the cute Rael to the class. She introduces herself in a rather odd way until Lynn asks her about her family. Glenn quickly cuts in and tells Lynn that Rael has no family. Someone else asks Rael about her relationship with Glenn, and she says she exists only for Glenn. This revelation leaves a disappointed look on the boys' faces as they had already been planning to make advances. After all the necessary introductions, Glenn takes his class to the yard for shock bolt training. Cien goes first and passes it easily. It's Rael's turn next, and she flunks the entire thing. Glenn moves closer to give her some advice. Rael asks him if she has to use the shock bolt spell, but Glenn says she can use any spell as long as it's effective. Rael smiles and uses a summoning spell to conjure a big sword, then flings the sword toward the dummy and rips it apart. The students immediately understand that Rael is dangerous. Since the practical session, everyone starts keeping their distance from Rael. During the lunch break, Cien and Rumia both invite Rael to eat with them. Rael stares at some strawberry tarts, and Cien gets one for her. Rael munches heavily on the tarts and draws emotional attention from the students, who gather around to witness her cuteness. Glenn meets up with Celica in the library and gets teased again. After the lunch break, Glenn takes his students to the Alchemy Research Lab, which is located near Saria Beach Resort. The boys are disappointed about going on such a field trip, but Glenn reassures them they'll get to feast their eyes on the beautiful girls in their swimsuits when they get to the beach. Upon arrival, Glenn finds Albert disguised as an artifact trader. Glenn asks him what he's doing there, and Albert tells him he's keeping an eye on Rumia. He also warns Glenn to be very careful with Rael for obvious reasons. Later on, Glenn and his class board a ship to the laboratory. Upon arriving, they all get off the ship and don their swimsuits. The boys get to see the beautiful ladies in their swimwear. Glenn encourages them to go play with the girls. The boys couldn't be any happier, and soon the girls challenge the boys to a beach volleyball competition. Glenn joins the boys, and together they all play beach volleyball for hours. By nightfall, Glenn catches the boys planning to infiltrate the girls' rooms. He tries to stop them from doing such a serious act, but the boys fight back. Up on their balcony, the girls watch the bunch of dumb males fight each other for them. As expected, Glenn shocks his entire class of male students and leaves them lying on the ground. Following his victory, Glenn heads to the beach to relax. He sees the girls, Cien, Rumia, and Rael, playing in the water. Glenn gets very happy to see Rael smile and wonders why Albert told him to be careful of her earlier. He falls asleep shortly and wakes up very late in the night. Rael hears him coming to the hotel and meets him on the way. She asks Glenn why he left the Imperial Mage Corps in the first place. Glenn tells her he does feel guilty every now and then for leaving the Imperial Mage Corps. Rael tells him she doesn't know what or who to live for anymore, and that Glenn has always been the person she lives for. Glenn cuts in and tells her to calm down and find her own path and happiness. This concept sounds very new to Rael, so she becomes enraged and accuses Cien and Rumia of stealing Glenn away from her. All attempts to calm her down are futile as Rael runs away. Eleanor meets with another member of the Researchers of Divine Wisdom to begin their Plan B to capture the Amplifier, Rumia. On their second day on the island, Glenn takes his students through the dense woods to get to the White Alchemy Research Lab, situated deep in the forest. On their way there, Cien and Rumia notice Rael looking gloomy and angry. They ask her what the matter is, but Rael pushes them and runs away. Cien and Rumia wonder what could have gone wrong with Rael, and Glenn tells them Rael is upset at him for what he said the previous night. Glenn and his class decide to leave Rael to herself and continue their journey until they reach the White Alchemy Research Lab. There, they meet the director of the lab, Burks Blayman, who gives them a tour of the entire facility. Cien and Rumia contemplate checking in on Rael, who's just sitting in a corner, but they decide it's best to let her be for now. Burks shows the students the research they do there. The alchemists mix and match DNA from various plants and animals to create chimeras. Chimeras are new species created by fusing two different DNAs together. Cien and Rumia discuss the revival of a dead human and wonder if the alchemists could do something like that. Burks cuts in on their conversation and tells them there's been research on such a concept before. The project, called Project Revive Life, was created by using magic to take three important elements from different people and use them to create a duplicate of the dead person. In other words, they'd be creating a clone. The girls are very surprised, but Glenn tells them the project was shut down ages ago, seeing as lots of people had to die for a few to be revived. Burks mentions that the Researchers of Divine Wisdom may be after such research, but wouldn't be able to get their hands on it. Cien and Rumia ask a few more questions, and they're done with the tour. That evening, Cien invites Rael to have lunch with them, but she refuses. Glenn also tries to apologize, but Rael just leaves them and runs to the beach. Upon reaching the beach, Rael sheds tears and wonders why she's like this. Meanwhile, Glenn gathers Rumia and Cien to ask them to forgive Rael since she's just a child at heart. Cien and Rumia assure him they understand and won't lose patience with her. Glenn thanks them for their understanding and heads straight to town to find Rael. In the meantime, Rael gets a visit from a rather odd person. Her brother, who she thought was dead, appears right in front of her. Albert, who's been tracking Rael, sees her devious brother talking to her. He tries to intervene, but is blocked by a repulsion spell. Eleanor also joins to keep him busy while Rael's brother carries out their plans. Albert takes the bait and fights Eleanor. Eleanor uses a necromancer spell to summon some spirits to attack Albert, but Albert dispels them all. Elsewhere, Cien and Rumia wonder what could be wrong with Rael to make her act like this. They come to no conclusion, so Cien gets up to buy something in town. Rael asks her brother how he's still alive. The man tells her he was still breathing when she thought he died. He then asks for Rael's help. Should Rael help him capture Rumia Tingel, the Researchers of Divine Wisdom who captured him earlier would let him go. He asks Rael for her loyalty to him. Before she gets to say anything, Glenn arrives to keep Rael safe. Rael's brother remembers Glenn as the dreadful mage of justice and fears for his life. Rael stays behind as Glenn summons her weapon and stabs his lung. Albert sees this and stops his fight with Eleanor. He also sees the culprit running toward the hotel, but tends to Glenn first. In the next scene, Cien returns from town with some groceries. She finds Rael with Rumia, stained with blood. Cien asks Rael why she'd ever do something like that to Rumia. Rael tells her she didn't kill Rumia, she killed Glenn. Reality dawns on Cien as she realizes her master may indeed be dead. She tries attacking the intruder, but Rael dares her to shoot her. Cien freezes on the spot and gets too scared to actually attack Rael, despite Rael telling her she won't fight back. Eventually, RA escapes with Rumia, leaving Cien in her tears. Seconds later, Albert arrives with Glenn's unconscious body. Cien begins crying for her master, but Albert tells her to calm down and focus on healing her master first. He starts a healing ritual and tells Cien to begin doing CPR for Glenn so they don't lose him before he activates the spell. Cien gets right on to kissing Glenn in the name of doing the ritual. Rumia finds out Rael is the person behind all her capture and Glenn's death, and she's terrified. Glenn dreams about Rael asking him for help. In the dream, he finds out he's too late and jolts back up to reality. Turns out the healing magic was successful, and Glenn was already healed up from his wounds. He asks Albert for an update on their mission. Albert tells him, first of all, that his survival is all thanks to his student CN. Then he tells him about the suspicious flow of funds going into the laboratory. This could only mean one thing. Director Burks is working with the researchers of Divine Wisdom. Glenn gets annoyed at Albert for allowing Rumia to be captured before doing anything about it. Albert tells him his superiors didn't have any choice but to use her as bait. This was the only way to find their lair. He also tells Glenn that he has orders to shoot Rael on sight if he finds her. Glenn tries to tell Albert that Rael is his student, and he won't allow anything bad to happen to her. However, Albert tells him he'll give him a chance to save Rael, but only if he catches up to her first. He then accuses Glenn of abandoning his comrades and punches him in the face for it. Once they both settle their scores, Albert gives Glenn his military pistol and urges him to go find Rumia with him. Back in Burke's lair, the evil mastermind Burke is seen laughing profusely over torturing Rumia. He commends Rumia's brother for turning Rael against her teacher and continues torturing poor Rumia. Eleanor also arrives there to spectate the whole thing going on. She feels something weird on her shoulders and figures it out. As it turns out, Albert placed a tracking spell on her shoulder and has been following it ever since. It's too late now, though, as Glenn and Albert have already found the sewer they were hiding in. Burke sees them on his monitor and sends a chimera lion creature to attack them. Without blinking, Albert takes down the chimera immediately. Burke's very surprised and sends a bigger and stronger monster to the duo. This time, Glenn uses an extinction ray to blast the chimera out of existence. Meanwhile, CN explains the whole situation to her colleagues. They all contemplate searching for the bastard they called their teacher, but Sistine tells them to trust Glenn for once. Goldie also backs CN up and tells his classmates they all have to trust their sensei. After watching all his chimeras go down one by one, Burke decides to handle matters himself. He boycotts Glenn and Albert on their way and morphs into a large chimera himself. Albert holds him off and allows Glenn to get to Rumia. On getting to Burke's lab, Glenn faces Rael and her nonsensical brother. Rael, whose loyalty still lies with her brother, summons her large sword and attacks Glenn. Glenn tries to tell her that's not her brother. Apparently, her real brother had died years ago. Rael wasn't listening, and Glenn knows this, so he fights her in hopes of understanding her position. Rael attacks Glenn without constraint, and Glenn repels her with his pistol. As they keep fighting, Glenn challenges Rael to say her brother's name. Her fake brother already knows what's going to happen, so he tries bringing her back to reality. However, Rael was already far gone as she desperately tries to remember her brother's name. Glenn takes advantage of this and pins her down to the ground with a gravity spell. Now that Rael is immobilized, Glenn frees Rumia from her chains and faces Rael's fake brother. As she lies on the ground, Rael remembers her origin. Apparently, the girl we all know as Rael is nothing but a clone of a girl named Elugia. Rael, short for Revive Life, was created by her fake brother and Elugia's brother. When the Imperial House heard of the atrocities being committed to making Project Revive Life a success, they decided to shut it down. Elugia and her brother were in support of this, but the fake brother wasn't. So he killed Elugia and her brother and then released Rael to the world. This revelation makes Rael realize she's been working for the bad guys all along. As she stares blankly into the room, her fake brother releases 3 other Raels he cloned through the years and charges them to attack Rael. Glenn saves his student from imminent death and knocks the Raels down one by one. Rael keeps asking Glenn why he would go that far for her, but Glenn tells her she is and always will be a student. Rael makes her resolve and kills all their clones. Now that he's lost, Glenn faces the fake brother and knocks him out cold. At about that same time, Albert destroys Burke for good. The next day, Rael returns back to the island with Glenn and Albert. A little while later, Glenn and Albert spectate a volleyball matchup between the students on a beach. Eleanor, the criminal, reports to her superiors the good news. They finally retrieve the entire research for Project Revive Life. Glenn and Albert spectate the students playing some volleyball on the beach. While they play, Albert sees CN and tells Glenn that CN has some resemblance to Sarah Silvers. Now, who's Sarah Silvers? I don't know. I guess we find out soon. The next scene shows the most annoying criminal ever, Eleanor. Only this time, she meets with her organization's grandmaster, who asks her about the Project Revive Life and Princess Armenia's capture. Eleanor tells him about the researchers' plan to capture Rumia, and the grandmaster gives her the go-ahead. Several miles away, Rael has her first dinner with CN's parents. Ever since she's been saved, she lives with a Fievel family. CN's parents are happy to see a new addition to their family. They ask Rael about any affinity between Glenn and her. Rael tells them just how much she adores Glenn. Dinner becomes very awkward after that. but thankfully it ends in peace. After dinner, Rael joins Cien and Rumia on the balcony and apologizes for her actions these past few weeks. Cien and Rumia tell her it's all good now, that they're all safe and sound. The next day, Cien runs into Celica in the library. Celica finds out about Cien's dream of becoming a mage and encourages her to keep trying till she makes it. Cien thanks her and takes her leave. Celica heads straight to the underground labyrinth of the library to find something unrevealed. In the meantime, Glenn finds his favorite student Cien studying something in the library. He joins her and thanks her for saving him with mouth-to-mouth resuscitation revival bag when he was supposed to die. Cien's eyes immediately turn red from embarrassment. Just then, Rumia and Rael arrive to find their sister's face all red. Rael gets very angry and blasts Glenn out of the library. Glenn falls in the way of an oncoming wagon. The traveler uses a wind magic spell to blow Glenn out of the way. He stops his wagon and gets out to meet his longtime friend in love, Cien. You heard right. Turns out Leos Klaus, the passenger from the wagon, is Cien's childhood friend and has been invited as a guest lecturer at the Alzano Academy. So, when they were younger, Leos and Cien made a promise to be married in the future. Turns out our golden boy kept his end of the promise. He approaches Cien and tells her he's ready to marry her. Glenn laughs at the entire situation and gets to know the new teacher. Leos is the perfect good guy, as he keeps praising Glenn all the way. Even Celica senses something suspicious. Why would a guest lecturer be transferred to the school just to replace a teacher with an extended medical leave? Anyways, Leos gets right to work and delivers a very wonderful, very advanced lecture to the students. When the bell rings, he ends the lecture. Glenn isn't so comfortable with teaching such low-level students material force theory. A student understanding this theory could prove to be very bad for the world. Rumia finds him pondering and tells him she understands his viewpoint. Glenn makes it into a joke again and congratulates his white cat, aka Cien, for having such a wonderful hubby. Just then, Leos comes by and asks Cien to meet him alone in the yard. There, Leos brings up some small talk and proposes to Cien. Rumia, Rael, and Glenn, who are eavesdropping on their conversation, are surprised when Cien rejects the proposal. Leos asks her why, and Cien lies that she still wants to fulfill her grandfather's dream of unraveling the mysteries of a hard-to-pronounce castle in the sky. Leos passes it as a useless dream and asks her out again. Glenn simply cannot let his student's dream be passed off as useless, so he gets out of his hiding place and tells Leos to back off. Leos counters, telling him not to interfere in their personal affairs, saying it's none of Glenn's business. Cien cuts in and lies that she and Glenn are lovers that have been tied to be married since the dawn of time. Glenn plays along and chases the loser, Leos, away. Leos doesn't back down, so Glenn challenges him to a magic duel. The winner gets the girl. And that's it, guys. The world's two biggest dongles fight over a 16-year-old girl. In his next class, Glenn tells the students that he's to teach them some pretty advanced stuff so he can win his duel with the guest teacher and marry into Cien's rich lineage. His entire class erupts in disgust. That night, Albert meets with Glenn at a tavern. He berates Glenn for fighting for a woman he doesn't love, but Glenn tells him he doesn't mind since he'll be marrying into a rich family anyway. Albert gets to the matter at hand and tells Glenn someone is smuggling Angel's dust into the city again. Glenn's face lights up and wonders who could be committing such atrocities. Albert tells him to back off from investigating the crime. On his way back home, Glenn flashes back to one of the sweet moments he had with Sarah when she was alive. Glenn keeps his head down and walks home sad. Leos is seen talking to a creepy man in a cloak about Glenn. He tells Leos things went according to plan and that he now has a duel with Glenn. As the episode ends, the man tells Leos to keep up the good work. Turns out there's actually more to Leos than meets the eye. On a fresh Monday morning, Leos' Class 4 faces Glenn's Class 2, with Holly and a few other teachers being the referees of the matchup. The rules of this tactical game are for the two teachers to act as military commanders and control their divisions, or their students, to conduct coordinated attacks on the opposing team. Whichever team loses, all its members loses the matchup. Also, if any of the commanders is knocked down during the fight, the other team wins. After the instructions have been spelled out, Class 2 turns towards Cien. They all ask her who she'd prefer to marry. Cien naturally tells them she prefers no one, but we all know she secretly wishes Glenn wins the fight. She even daydreams about her almighty doofus master proposing to her. Of course, she snaps herself back to reality and gets ready for the fight. In the next few minutes, each division takes their positions. Once the tournament begins, Class 4 quickly takes the three-man cell formation and conducts quick, coordinated magic attacks on Glen's students in the first wave of attacks. Class 2 falls behind. This brings a smile to Holly's face. It's not surprising, though, seeing as he hates Glen's guts. However, even he still suspects Glen has an ace up his sleeve, as Glen is always known to do the unexpected to win. Glen doesn't disappoint as well. He knows his class's current capacity would be too premature to learn an advanced battle formation like the three-man cell formation. Instead, he teaches them how to perfect the two-man cell battle formation. When the time is right, Class 2 shocks everyone and activates the technique. They return the attacks on Class 4 and regain their standing. Holly and the others aren't surprised. Leos splits the team into segments and tells some of them to attack. However, that garrison comes face-to-face with the dreadful Rail. Bad news for Class 4, as Rail beats the heck out of that garrison. Leos still doesn't accept defeat and turns to a stealthy tactic. This time, he sends another garrison to infiltrate Class 2 from the back by passing through the woodlands on the right side of their battleground. Little did they know Glen had used himself as a pawn. He appears at the entrance of the forest and baits the students to chase after him. The garrison chases after him and gets trapped. Glen takes their radio device and tells Leos his men have been captured. Cien and the others also do their part, chasing the other Class 4 members away. Leos uses the remaining members of his division to launch one big attack. To avoid things getting out of hand, Holly cuts the duel short and declares the duel a tie. After the duel, Glen congratulates his class for doing so well, even against all odds. Leos, on the other hand, talks down on his students for not winning the duel. Glen sees this and goes on to talk to Leos again. Leos gets annoyed and challenges Glen to another duel over Cien. Cien tries to prevent this duel from happening, but Glen accepts it, provided that they fight one-on-one this time. Sistine gets so annoyed that she slaps Glen again for the second time in the series and runs away. Glen doesn't even phase. Instead, he gets back to coordinating with his team. In the next scene, Cien and Rumia talk a little about Glen. Rumia tells Cien to confront their teacher over her feelings instead of just hating him without reason. Pretty solid advice, to be honest. Thankfully, Cien takes the advice and promises to talk to him the next time they see him. Somewhere around town, Albert and a few other court mages find a dead body and tie it to angel dust overdosage. Just what is going on? Right on his way home, Leos talks with that creepy man again. The creepy man tells Leos to be very careful of the unpredictable Glen radars. However, Leos passes Glen off as below him and promises to be head of their family once he gets Cien. That night, Cien overhears Glen talking about Sarah and joins him on the roof of the academy building. Cien asks him who Sarah Silver was, and Glen begins his origin story. Apparently, Glen was once a magic enthusiast like Rumia and Sistine, as he wanted to become a mage of justice. However, when he joined the Imperial Court Mage Corps, he was forced to use his magic to kill. The endless bloodshed made him tired of magic altogether and almost gave up on his dream. However, only one person, Sarah, still kept him sane in this accursed world. Sarah was Glen's only hope in humanity until she was killed in battle. Ever since then, he's quit and become jobless. He then tells her he accepted the duel because Leos was talking down on her dream, and he couldn't have that. Cien is disappointed to hear Glen wasn't fighting for her hand in marriage, but she takes what she gets. Glen also supports and teases her. As the duo laughs and plays, the real devil joins them. Leos tells Glen that he's had enough time to properly research Glen's past and has seen all the horrendous things he did. He threatens Glen that he's going to tell Cien everything. Glen immediately gets serious and warns Leos to never speak of his past to anyone. However, Leos riles him up more and brings up more disgusting details about Glen's past. This gets Glen angry enough to attack Leos. Surprisingly, Leos defends Glen's close combat attacks and knocks him down. Then he uses the secret military spell TPS to summon imaginary beings to fight Glen. Glen tries to use his Fool Arcana card to nullify the magic, but it doesn't work. After seeing all his enemy could do, Glen calls it quits and walks away. Cien rushes after him, but Leos holds her down and orders her to never go after Glen again. He also tells her he knows all about Rumia being Tingle and Rail being a clone. The next morning, Glen doesn't show up for class at all, let alone for the duel. I hope he's fine though. Glenn avoids going to the academy for a few days. One day, Leos meets with his soon-to-be wife, Sistine, in class and invites her to discuss some things with him. Cien reluctantly accepts his request and follows him to his office. Rumia and Rael notice something off about Cien. She clearly shouldn't be marrying the psycho. Nonetheless, Rumia holds Rael back and tells her to wait for Glenn first. Rael asks Rumia if she knows the whereabouts of Glenn. Rumia tells Rael that she immediately questioned Cien on the night Glenn disappeared. After seeing the tear-ridden face of her dear sister, Rumia went straight to inform Glenn about the whole thing. Glenn promised to do something about it. Ever since then, he's been nowhere to be found. A week passes by, and it's time for Cien to get married. Everything goes smoothly in the marriage until Glenn arrives at the last minute to stop the whole facade from happening. The students couldn't be any happier to see their master. Glenn throws some smoke bombs on the altar and takes Cien to a part of town. Cien cries and asks him where he's been all this time. Glenn apologizes and tells her he's been preparing to face Leos ever since his fight that night. Before then, he went back to his old friends and acquired all the toys and tools he used to use back when he was in the Imperial Court Mage Corps. He also tells Cien that he wonders how a guy like Leos, who's hopelessly in love with Cien, would be so cold toward her. Cien tells Glenn that the Leos she was about to marry isn't the one she knew. Just then, zombies attack the two. At that same moment, zombies attack the academy too. Thankfully, Albert and the other Magic Corps members arrive in time to help the students take them all out. Meanwhile, Glenn notices the zombies growing in number and decides the only thing he can do is run. He takes out a few zombies and clears a path. Then he carries Cien and makes a run for it. Cien keeps freezing up from the shock of being in danger. At one point, Glenn connects the same situation to old times when he was fighting alongside Sarah. This time, Glenn doesn't allow history to repeat itself. He protects Cien and takes out all the zombies. When he's done, Cien pushes him away. Leos arrives as soon as the zombies are gone and changes to his true form. Apparently, the person they all thought was Leos is a former member of the Imperial Court Mage Corps, the Mage of Justice, Jadis. Jadis challenges Glenn to a one-on-one fight without any interference from Cien. Glenn accepts the fight and sends Cien away. Then he asks his opponent what he is after. Jadis tells Glenn that he's after the Ashik records. The Ashik records contain the power to rule over the principles of the whole world. After telling Glenn all he had to say, Jadis releases the TPS spell and begins his duel with Glenn. Cien lies on the ground somewhere, regretting ever pushing her precious sensei away. Glenn, on the other hand, keeps on fighting and defending against Jadis' attacks. He tries a sneak attack to seal the monster, but Jadis pins him down. Glenn is left with nothing. Just as he's about to be executed, Cien arrives and blows Jadis away. Glenn asks her why she came back, and Sistine tells him she's finally made up her mind to stay by his side and fight this monster with him. Glenn opens his eyes wide as he marvels at how brave Cien has gotten. Jadis gets his bearings and now faces two enemies. Glenn accepts Cien as his equal, and together they launch coordinated attacks to knock down their enemy. After being knocked down several times, Jadis uses the ace up his sleeve and summons the Lady of Justice, Juza. Cien pierces a hole in the being and buys Glenn enough time to land a huge punch in Jadis' face. Jadis accepts defeat and takes his leave. Before he goes, however, he tells Glenn not to forget that the Alzano Empire was created to do evil and that it had to be destroyed by all means. When he's finally gone, Glenn's students meet up with their teacher and top student. That night, Glenn meets up with Albert and the other mages in the tavern. He tells them about the Ashik records and wonders what could be contained in such texts. At that same moment, Eleanor is seen at that castle in the sky, checking out some riddle on a stone. The night goes by smoothly, and Glenn's back in school the next day. In the final moments of the episode, Celica teases Glenn again and pushes him to meet his students. Glenn happily goes to his class and is actually excited to teach his students.